Lecture 2 for Chapter 14 picks up where we left off. Here's the situation in the United States. As you can see, we have free states in blue and slave states or territories in orange. And what we've been talking about is that the United States is basically dodging a civil war over slavery during the 1840s and 1850s by trying to enact a series of compromises. While that's happening, we're getting a tremendous change in the way that the parties operate. And we basically have a few things. Number one, the Whigs are going to collapse. By 1852, the Whigs really couldn't please their pro-slavery Southern wing or even their anti-slavery Northern wing. And so by 1856, they were basically hardly a party at all. The collapse of the Whigs left the Democrats as the country's really only national party, and they discovered in popular sovereignty, which is the idea that the people should decide whether they want slavery or not. They decided with popular sovereignty that that was something that many Democrats could support. And of course, the South became a southern, the Democrats rather became a Southern-dominated party. And what's going to start to happen over time is you can clearly see that in every presidential election we have the disintegration of the Whigs, really starting around 1848 as they can't please both sides of their party, and into 1852 and into 1856 even. And then we get the birth of the Republicans. And it's really right here that we're going to get into some events that really push the United States to the brink of the Civil War. So if you understand the political system and how it's changing and how the Whigs are gone and now eventually the Republicans are going to be there, that goes a long way to understanding why the Civil War really started. And this is another chart that shows the changing political landscape that shows you in just a different way the party members in the House of Representatives. And clearly you can see that the Whigs are declining after 1848, 1852. And then you can see by 1856 the birth of the Republican Party and them becoming more prominent. Well, there are more party changes, and the new parties are Know-Nothings and Republicans in the 1850s. The Know-Nothings are basically nativists. They believe firmly that Americans that live here in the United States are the primary citizens in the United States, and that they should the American government should be something that's for the native-born people in the United States. It's very racist and very anti-immigrant when you think about it. As you can see, it clearly says anti-Catholics and anti-immigrants, probably resulting in the fear that immigrants and foreign ideas are penetrating our soil. The more significant party is the Republicans. And the Republican Party is basically made up of a bunch of different people. First of all, Northern Whigs, who don't have a party anymore and who see their party as disintegrating. Northern Democrats, who really don't identify with the ideals of the South anymore. Free Soilers, who believe that people that settle on land, that those states should be free. That's what free soil means. Basically, you're on the land and you should be able to have freedom instead of slavery. It's also made up of some of the Know-Nothings, so kind of Again, that anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic feel to it. And then there are also other opponents of the Kansas and Nebraska Act, which we will get into in just a little bit. Northern fear of slave power intensified in the 1850s for a number of reasons. First of all, mostly having to do with Kansas. With the Kansas and Nebraska Act allowing settlement of Kansas, there was a huge advertising campaign in both the North and South to promote settlement into Kansas and Nebraska, to come there from the free states or the slave states. People in Missouri, which is the border, let me pull up a map here real quick. People in Missouri, which is a slave state, thought it was important to secure Kansas for slavery, and thousands of frontiersmen from Missouri actually arrived and sort of invaded Kansas to try to stake it out, and to try to claim it for their own, and to make sure that it would be a slave state. Due to this sort of invasion from Missouri, you have pro-slavery candidates sweeping the territorial elections in November of 1854, but free soil Kansans elected their own legislature at the same time, which promptly banned both slaves and free blacks from the territory. And so what you had in Kansas is two rival governments, and armed to the teeth, ready to fight, and Kansans verged on civil war. So fighting broke out on the morning of May 21st, 1856, when several hundred pro-slavery men raided the town of Lawrence. And after that, a retaliatory raid by John Brown, who was an anti-slavery advocate, ensued. And so really what you had was a situation that's like a mini civil war. I always think of Kansas as like the prelude to the big Civil War, because it's essentially the same thing. To make matters worse, in May 1856, Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts delivered a speech titled "The Crime Against Kansas," which included a personal attack on South Carolina Senator Andrew P. Butler. Preston Brooks, who was a South Carolina representative on the side of Butler, entered the Senate and beat Sumner over the head with his cane until Charles Sumner lay bleeding and unconscious on the floor. That must have been a sight to see. Let's come back to those concepts, but here you have essentially the mini civil war in Kansas. Again, rival governments that are free soil. The other government is pro-slavery, fighting it out here, and you can see that on the map. So again, a civil war before the Civil War. Here in this photograph you can see armed settlers near Lawrence, Kansas. It was a very tense situation. And here's the famous fight in the United States Senate where Charles Sumner and Congressman Preston Brooks beats Charles Sumner over the head. The caning of Charles Sumner is what this picture is called. So we're having war in Kansas, we're having war in the United States Congress, and then this. So the Dred Scott decision happens, and basically in 1833, you have an army doctor who brings the slave Dred Scott, pictured here. He brings him to Missouri. He has him in Missouri and takes him to Illinois and then to the Wisconsin Territory before returning to Missouri. Dred Scott claimed that since living in Illinois, which was a free state, and Wisconsin was a free territory, had made his family free, and that they remained free even after returning to Missouri, a slave state. So the question is, can a slave owner take somebody to a free state, and is that person then still a slave, or are they property? Well, the U.S. Supreme Court made a decision that basically said Dred Scott is not a citizen of the United States, therefore he can't legally claim his constitutional rights. He's a slave after all. The laws of Dred Scott State, which was Missouri, dictate his status, which is a slave, and that does not make him free. And so the reaction to this, which again, basically Dred Scott is still a slave even after he sues for his freedom. The reaction up north is just one of just flabbergastedness, if that's even a word. White Southerners were very happy about this because this affirmed that the slaves were property, you know. Northerners, Northern abolitionists more specifically, and Republicans now were very frustrated with this decision, and thus this added to the tension. So you have Bleeding Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, and into this comes a very prominent young politician named Abraham Lincoln. Abraham Lincoln, the famous log cabin background, earned good money as a lawyer, but eventually decided upon politics. His views concerning slavery were that, for his time, moderate racial views, I would say. He denounced slavery and defended black humanity, but at the same time he viewed black equality as completely impractical and unachievable. He accepted that Congress and the Constitution would permit slavery in the states where it existed, but he believed that Congress should contain its spread. So this seems to be the Republican Party's main goal, is stopping the spread of slavery. In an intense political environment, should a Republican get elected, you can probably guess how difficult it will be to hold the nation together, which is exactly what's going to happen. Here's a funny cartoon about Abraham Lincoln. Check that out on your own time, please. Let's continue. In a very famous series of debates against rival United States Senator Stephen A. Douglas, future President Lincoln gives a series of great debates here, talking about the evils of the spread of slavery. Lincoln would badger Douglas in these debates, questioning whether or not he favored the spread of slavery. Lincoln just, at some points, just flat out talked about slavery as being wrong, and because a man has the right to the fruits of his own labor. These debates for a United States Senate seat kind of thrust President Lincoln, or future President Lincoln, into the national spotlight, even though he lost the election against Douglas. And 2 years later, of course, you're going to have President Lincoln, which is a Republican. Now, Lincoln is elected, and that is where we'll stop our video for now. And in the third part of chapter 14, we'll talk about his election and the consequences of his election to the future of the United States.